The radio crackled with desperate voices. "We've lost another squad to the sniper. That's 12 men in 2 days." The commanding officer's hands shook as he held the radio. 3 months of relentless attacks had turned his elite soldiers into sitting ducks. The enemy sniper seemed invisible, untouchable, almost supernatural in their ability to strike and vanish. "Sir, we've tried everything. Counter-sniper teams, artillery, even airstrikes. Nothing works. They're too good, too fast." In a war-torn building across no man's land, 20-year-old Lyudmila Pavlichenko adjusted her rifle scope and studied the enemy positions. She had been watching for hours, learning their patterns, understanding their weaknesses. The Soviet military had dismissed her application twice. "War is no place for a woman," they said, "especially not on the front lines." But as the radio chatter grew more frantic and more soldiers fell to the enemy sniper's deadly precision, something was about to change. In exactly 18 minutes, this young woman would do what entire military units couldn't accomplish. She would prove that sometimes the most underestimated person becomes the most dangerous weapon. The enemy had no idea that death was watching them through a scope held by steady female hands. They had terrorized an entire front for months, believing themselves untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. What happened in those 18 minutes would rewrite military history and create the most feared sniper the world had ever known. This is the true story of how one woman turned the tide of war with a single, impossible shot that no one believed could be made. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Kyiv University campus as Lyudmila Pavlichenko walked between the ancient buildings, her history textbooks clutched against her chest. At 20 years old, she was one of the few female students pursuing advanced historical studies, but her mind wasn't focused on ancient civilizations that morning. The radio broadcasts from the Western Front had been growing more desperate each day, and she could see the worry etched on every face around campus. It was June 1941, and Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union had begun just weeks earlier. The German war machine was rolling across the countryside like an unstoppable force, crushing everything in its path. Cities fell one after another, and refugees streamed eastward with horrifying stories of destruction and death. Lyudmila had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories from the Great War. He had been a soldier, and she remembered sitting on his knee as a small child, listening to tales of courage and sacrifice. But there was something else she remembered from those stories, something that burned in her mind as she watched her country being torn apart. Her grandfather had taught her that sometimes the most ordinary people could do the most extraordinary things when their homeland was threatened. She had always been different from other girls her age. While they played with dolls, she had begged her grandfather to teach her to shoot. He had an old rifle from his military service, and during summer visits to his small village outside Kyiv, he would take her to the woods and show her how to hold the weapon, how to breathe, how to find that moment of perfect stillness where the shot becomes inevitable. "Shooting is not about pulling a trigger," he had told her when she was barely 12 years old. "It is about becoming one with your target, understanding the wind, feeling the earth beneath you, and knowing in your soul exactly when the moment is right." Those words echoed in her mind now as she made a decision that would change her life forever. That afternoon, Lyudmila walked into the Soviet Army recruitment office in downtown Kyiv. The building was packed with young men eager to defend their homeland, their voices loud and confident as they discussed their future military careers. When she approached the desk, the recruiting sergeant looked up with confusion. "Miss, the women's auxiliary sign-ups are in the building next door," he said without looking up from his paperwork. "I want to be a sniper," Lyudmila said quietly but firmly. The sergeant's pen stopped moving. He looked up at her with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Around them, the conversations gradually died as other recruits turned to listen to what they assumed would be a brief and amusing exchange. "A sniper?" The sergeant laughed, and several of the men joined in. "Young lady, do you have any idea what snipers do? They crawl through mud for days, sleep in foxholes, and kill enemy soldiers from long distances. It's not work for women." Lyudmila's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I can shoot better than most of the men in this room." The laughter grew louder. One young recruit, barely 18 himself, stepped forward with a cocky grin. I bet she's never even held a real rifle. Probably learned to shoot tin cans in her backyard. I learned to shoot from my grandfather, who served in the Imperial Army, Ludmilla replied. And I've been hunting since I was 14. I can hit a moving rabbit at 200 meters. The sergeant shook his head and returned to his paperwork. Miss, I appreciate your patriotic spirit, but the Soviet Army doesn't put women in combat positions. You can serve your country by joining the medical corps or communications. Next, but Ludmilla didn't move. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of every dismissive glance and condescending smile. Something inside her hardened, like steel being forged in fire. You're making a mistake, she said finally. The only mistake would be wasting training resources on someone who will crack under pressure the first time she hears a shell explode. The sergeant replied without looking up. Ludmilla turned and walked out of the recruitment office, but she didn't go home. Instead, she walked the streets of Kiev, her mind racing with determination and fury. She had read enough history to know that wars were won and lost by those who saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. If the regular army wouldn't accept her, she would find another way. 3 days later, she returned to the recruitment office, but this time she wasn't alone. She had spent those 3 days researching every regulation, every precedent, every possible avenue for female combat service. She had also visited her grandfather and asked him to write a letter describing her shooting abilities in detail. The same sergeant was behind the desk, and he groaned when he saw her approaching. Miss, I thought we settled this matter. Ludmilla placed a folder on his desk. According to Soviet Military Regulation 47C, any citizen who can demonstrate exceptional marksmanship skills may be considered for specialized sniper training, regardless of gender. She had spent hours in the library finding that obscure regulation, which had been written during the Civil War, but never officially repealed. The sergeant frowned and opened the folder. Inside was her grandfather's letter, written on official letterhead from his local Veterans Association. It described in precise military language her shooting abilities, including specific examples of accuracy at various distances. There were also 3 character references from university professors who could attest to her mental stability and determination. This is all very impressive, miss, but regulations or not, no woman has ever served as a frontline sniper in the Soviet Army. Then, I'll be the first, Ludmilla said simply. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Ludmilla herself. A voice spoke from behind her. What's the holdup, Sergeant? She turned to see a tall colonel with graying hair and intelligent eyes studying the scene with interest. The sergeant immediately stood at attention. Colonel Petrov, sir. This young woman is requesting sniper training. Colonel Petrov had seen enough of war to know that conventional thinking often led to conventional defeats. He had been walking through the recruitment center, observing the process, when he heard the unusual conversation. Something about the young woman's quiet confidence intrigued him. What's your name? He asked Ludmilla. Ludmilla Mikhailovna Pavlichenko, sir. And you believe you can be a sniper? I know I can, sir. The colonel studied her for a long moment. He had been fighting for over 20 years, and he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. What he saw in this young woman's eyes wasn't bravado or naive patriotism. It was something much rarer and more valuable, absolute certainty combined with intelligent calculation. Sergeant, give me that folder, he said. He read through the documents carefully while the room remained silent. Miss Pavlichenko, are you aware that snipers often work alone for days at a time, in conditions that would break most men? Yes, sir. Are you aware that the enemy shoots back, and that they specifically hunt snipers with extreme prejudice? Yes, sir. And you still want to do this? Ludmilla thought of her grandfather's stories, of her burning homeland, of all the dismissive faces that had told her she wasn't capable of defending what she loved. More than anything, sir. Colonel Petrov closed the folder and looked at the sergeant. Process her application. Full sniper training program. The sergeant's mouth fell open. Sir, with respect, she's never been tested. We don't know if she can actually shoot. The colonel smiled slightly. Then, we'll find out, won't we? But something tells me this young woman is going to surprise all of us. As Ludmilla filled out the paperwork, her hands shaking slightly with excitement and nerves, She had no way of knowing that she had just taken the first step toward becoming the most deadly sniper in military history. She had no idea that within months, enemy soldiers would whisper her name in terror, or that her skills would become so legendary that the Germans would put a massive bounty on her head. All she knew was that she had convinced someone to give her a chance, and she intended to make the most of it. As she signed her name on the enlistment papers, she thought of her grandfather's words about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She was about to discover just how extraordinary she could become. The training would be brutal. The war would test her in ways she couldn't imagine. But, in that moment, sitting in a noisy recruitment office in Kiev, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had no idea that she was about to change the course of history with nothing but her determination and a rifle. The enemy snipers who had been terrorizing the front lines were about to meet their match, and they would never see her coming. The sniper training facility outside Moscow was unlike anything Lyudmila had ever experienced. Hidden deep in the forest, it consisted of a series of wooden barracks surrounded by elaborate training courses designed to simulate every possible combat scenario. When she arrived in early July 1941, she was the only woman among 43 trainees, and the hostile stares made it clear that her presence was not welcome. The commanding officer of the facility was Major Boris Kozlov, a veteran sniper from the Finnish War who had personally eliminated over 60 enemy soldiers. He was a hard man with cold eyes and no patience for weakness. When he saw Lyudmila standing in formation with the other recruits, his expression suggested he was looking at a problem he would soon solve. "Comrades, you are here because someone believes you have the potential to become snipers," Major Kozlov began, pacing in front of the assembled group. "I am here to prove them wrong. 90% of you will wash out of this program. You will beg to be transferred to regular infantry. You will cry for your mothers and curse the day you thought you were special enough to be here." His gaze settled on Lyudmila. "Some of you clearly don't belong here at all. This is not a game. This is not an adventure. This is training to become a killer, and killers are not made from soft material." The first week was designed to break them physically and mentally. They woke at 4 in the morning and ran 10 kilometers through the forest carrying full packs. They crawled through mud under barbed wire while instructors fired live ammunition over their heads. They learned to remain motionless for hours at a time, fighting off insects, thirst, and the burning pain of muscles held in unnatural positions. Lyudmila had expected the physical challenges, but she hadn't anticipated the psychological warfare from her fellow trainees. They questioned her presence constantly, made crude jokes about her abilities, and seemed to take pleasure in her struggles. During equipment distribution, she was given a rifle that had clearly seen better days, while the men received newer, more reliable weapons. "Don't worry about the rifle, sweetheart," one trainee named Victor said with false sympathy. "You probably won't be here long enough for it to matter." But Lyudmila had learned something valuable from her grandfather's stories. He had told her that the most dangerous enemy was not always the one shooting at you from across a battlefield. Sometimes it was the person standing right beside you, undermining your confidence and waiting for you to fail. She decided to treat this training exactly like combat. Every challenge was an enemy to be defeated. Every setback was intelligence to be used for future victories. The shooting portion of training began in the second week, and this was where Lyudmila began to separate herself from the pack. Despite her inferior rifle, she consistently outshot most of her fellow trainees at every distance. At 100 meters, she could put 5 rounds through a target the size of a playing card. At 300 meters, she could hit a man-sized target in the chest 9 times out of 10. At 500 meters, distances that challenged even experienced marksmen, she rarely missed. Major Kozlov watched her performance with growing interest but showed no emotion. During individual evaluation sessions, he pushed her harder than any other trainee, demanding that she achieve perfect scores under increasingly difficult conditions. She had to shoot while exhausted from physical training, while instructors shouted in her ears, while smoke grenades created zero visibility conditions. "Why are you here, Pavlichenko?" he asked her during one particularly brutal session. She had been lying in position for 6 hours, waiting for a single shot at a target that appeared for only seconds at random intervals. "To serve my country, sir," she replied, never taking her eye from the scope. "That's what they all say?" What's the real reason? Ludmilla considered the question carefully. Through her scope, she could see the target area where the mechanical pop-up target would eventually appear. Because I'm tired of watching other people fight my battles, sir. Major Kozlov said nothing, but she caught a slight nod of approval. The target appeared suddenly, a brown silhouette against the tree-line. Ludmilla's shot was instantaneous and perfect, punching through the center of the target's chest area. The sound of the impact echoed across the range. Acceptable, Major Kozlov said, which was the highest praise anyone had heard him give. The advanced training phase introduced them to the psychological aspects of sniper warfare. They learned to think like hunters, to understand their prey, to become patient predators who could wait for days for the perfect opportunity. They studied camouflage not just as a way to hide, but as a way to become part of the environment itself. They learned to read weather patterns, to calculate wind drift, to compensate for temperature changes that could affect bullet trajectory. Most importantly, they learned to kill without hesitation. During one exercise, they were required to eliminate life-size targets that appeared suddenly in unexpected locations. The targets were designed to look like enemy soldiers, complete with detailed uniforms and equipment. The first time Ludmilla squeezed the trigger on what looked like a living human being, even though she knew it was just a training target, she felt a moment of hesitation that almost made her miss. Doubt will get you killed, Major Kozlov told her afterward. Doubt will get your comrades killed. When you look through that scope, you are not killing a person. You are eliminating a threat to your homeland. The enemy will not hesitate to kill you, your friends, your family. You cannot afford to hesitate either. It was a hard lesson, but Ludmilla understood that hesitation on a battlefield was not mercy. It was weakness that could cost lives. She began to approach each shot as a mathematical problem: distance, wind speed, temperature, target movement. When all variables were calculated correctly, the shot was inevitable. Personal feelings were irrelevant. By the fourth week, half of the original trainees had washed out. Some couldn't handle the physical demands. Others broke under the psychological pressure. A few simply realized they weren't capable of the level of precision required. Victor, the trainee who had mocked Ludmilla's rifle, was dismissed after failing to qualify at long-distance shooting for the third consecutive time. Looks like the girl has outlasted the big talker, another trainee observed as Victor packed his gear. But Ludmilla took no satisfaction in anyone's failure. She had learned to focus entirely on her own performance, to treat each day as a step toward becoming the weapon her country needed. She studied ballistics manuals by lamplight after exhausting training days. She practiced breathing exercises and meditation techniques to achieve the mental state necessary for perfect shots. She became obsessed with understanding every aspect of her equipment, learning to maintain and adjust her rifle until she could strip and reassemble it blindfolded. The final week of training was a comprehensive field exercise that simulated real combat conditions. Trainees were divided into pairs and sent into a forest area where they had to locate and eliminate specific targets while avoiding counter-sniper teams trying to hunt them down. They had to survive for 5 days with minimal supplies while completing their assigned missions. Ludmilla was paired with a quiet trainee named Alexei who had consistently ranked second in marksmanship throughout the program. He was skilled and reliable, but, more importantly, he had never questioned her presence or abilities. They developed a partnership based on mutual respect and complementary skills. On the third day of the exercise, they encountered their most challenging target, a veteran sniper instructor playing the role of an enemy marksman. He was positioned in a bell tower overlooking a valley that they needed to cross. For hours, they studied his position, looking for weaknesses in his setup. "He's good," Alexei whispered as they lay concealed in thick brush 600 meters from the tower. "He hasn't moved in over 2 hours. I can barely make out his position." Ludmilla studied the target through her scope, noting every detail. "He's too comfortable. See how he's positioned? He's focused on the obvious approaches. He expects us to try to get closer. So what do? We give him what he's not expecting. A shot from maximum range that he won't see coming." The distance was nearly 800 meters, at the absolute limit of effective rifle range under perfect conditions. The wind was variable, and the angle was challenging. It was the kind of shot that even experienced snipers might attempt only once in their careers. Ludmilla spent 20 minutes calculating every variable: wind speed and direction at ground level and at elevation, temperature differential between their position and the target area, the slight upward angle that would affect bullet trajectory. When she was satisfied with her calculations, she settled into the perfect shooting position and began controlling her breathing. "You sure about this?" Alexei asked nervously. "If you miss, he'll spot our muzzle flash, and we're dead." "I won't miss," Ludmilla said with quiet confidence. She waited for the perfect moment when her breathing was controlled, her pulse was steady, and the wind had momentarily calmed. Through her scope, she could see the instructor's position clearly. He was focused on scanning the valley below, completely unaware of the danger approaching from maximum range. The shot broke like thunder across the valley. 0.8 of a second later, the training round struck the instructor directly in the chest area, marking him as eliminated according to exercise rules. Even from their distant position, they could see him sit up in surprise, looking around for the source of the shot that had ended his part in the exercise. "Impossible," Alexei breathed. "That was the best shot I've ever seen." When they returned to base camp that evening, the instructor approached Ludmilla personally. 820 meters, he said simply. "In variable wind conditions. With a rifle that should have been retired years ago. I've been teaching snipers for 15 years, and I've never seen a shot like that." Major Kozlov was also waiting for them. "Pavlichenko, I need to speak with you privately." As they walked away from the other trainees, Ludmilla wondered if somehow she had done something wrong. Perhaps the shot had been too aggressive, too risky for a training exercise. "You graduate tomorrow," Major Kozlov said without preamble. "Top of your class. You'll be assigned to the 25th Rifle Division as a sniper specialist." "Thank you, sir." Major Kozlov stopped walking and turned to face her. "When I first saw you here, I thought Colonel Petrov had lost his mind. I was certain you would wash out in the first week." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was wrong. You have something that can't be taught. Natural instinct combined with absolute determination. You're going to be very dangerous to the enemy." "I hope so, sir." "One more thing. The 25th Division is being deployed to the Odessa front. The Germans have some of the best snipers in the world operating in that sector. They've been causing severe casualties among our forces." His expression grew serious. "You're about to face the real test. Training is over. Now you'll find out if you're truly as good as you appear to be." That night, as Ludmilla cleaned her rifle and prepared her equipment for deployment, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 months earlier, she had been a university student studying ancient history. Now she was a trained killer preparing to hunt human beings across a battlefield. The transformation felt surreal, but also inevitable. She had proven that she belonged, that she could compete with and exceed the performance of male soldiers. But she knew the real proof would come when she faced an enemy who was shooting back, when lives depended on her skills, when there were no second chances for missed shots. The training was over. The war was about to begin. The train carrying Ludmilla and the other new sniper graduates toward the Odessa front moved through the Ukrainian countryside at night, its windows blacked out to avoid enemy aircraft. Inside the cramped military car, 20 newly trained snipers tried to sleep on hard benches while the train swayed and lurched along damaged tracks. The sound of distant artillery had been growing louder for hours, a constant rumbling that seemed to make the very air vibrate with menace. Ludmilla pressed her face against a small gap in the blackout curtains and watched the darkness pass by. Occasionally, she could see the orange glow of fires on the horizon, evidence of the destruction that awaited them. This was no longer training. This was the real war, and she was traveling toward the most dangerous assignment a soldier could receive. When they arrived at the divisional headquarters, the scene was one of barely controlled chaos. The 25th Rifle Division had been fighting for weeks against German forces that were pushing hard toward the strategic port city of Odessa. The headquarters was established in what had once been a school, but the building bore the scars of recent shelling. Sandbags were piled around the entrances, and the windows had been boarded up after being blown out by blast waves. Colonel Andrei Volkov, the divisional commander, looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His uniform was stained with mud and sweat, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much death in too short a time. When he briefed the new sniper contingent, His words were blunt and unforgiving. Comrades, you arrive at a critical moment. The Germans have pushed us back 15 kilometers in the past month. They have artillery superiority, air superiority, and some of the best trained soldiers in the world. But, more than anything else, they have snipers who are killing our men faster than we can replace them. He walked to a large map pinned to the wall, marked with red and blue positions. The blue areas representing Soviet forces looked alarmingly small compared to the red German positions that seemed to surround them on 3 sides. The enemy has at least a dozen sniper teams operating in our sector. They move at night, take positions in destroyed buildings, and pick off our soldiers during daylight hours. Our men are afraid to move in the open. Supply lines are being cut. Communication trenches are death traps. We've lost 3 company commanders and countless NCOs to these invisible killers. His finger traced along the front lines on the map. Your job is to hunt these snipers and eliminate them. This is not about killing random enemy soldiers. This is about finding and destroying specific individuals who are crippling our combat effectiveness. It's personal warfare at its most deadly. Ludmilla studied the map carefully, noting the positions where sniper attacks had occurred. There was a pattern emerging, clusters of incidents around certain buildings and terrain features. The enemy snipers were operating systematically, not randomly. Sir, have there been any attempts to coordinate counter-sniper operations? She asked. Colonel Volkov looked at her with surprise. You have experience with counter-sniper tactics? Only theoretical, sir. But it appears the enemy is using multiple teams working in coordination. Single sniper hunts might not be effective. The colonel's expression showed grudging interest. What do you recommend? Ludmilla moved closer to the map. If we could establish overlapping fields of observation and coordinate our movements, we might be able to trap them between multiple positions. Force them to reveal themselves when they try to relocate. It was a bold suggestion from a soldier who had never fired a shot in combat, but Colonel Volkov had been fighting long enough to recognize tactical intelligence when he heard it. We'll consider that. For now, you'll be assigned to Captain Dmitry Sergeyev's company. They've taken the heaviest sniper casualties. You'll get your first taste of real combat there. Captain Sergeyev was a veteran infantry officer who had been fighting since the first day of the invasion. He was a compact, weathered man with intelligent eyes and a reputation for keeping his soldiers alive through superior tactics and careful planning. When Colonel Volkov introduced Ludmilla as his new sniper specialist, Sergey's reaction was immediate and predictable. Colonel, with respect, I requested an experienced sniper. My men are dying out there. This soldier graduated top of her sniper class and shows exceptional aptitude, the colonel replied. Her? Sir, I need a killer, not a training school graduate who's never been shot at. Ludmilla had expected this reaction, but it still stung. Captain, give me one opportunity to prove my capabilities. If I can't perform, transfer me wherever you want. Captain Sergeyev studied her for a long moment. One chance. But, understand this. My company has lost 18 men in the past 2 weeks. 12 of them to sniper fire. I don't have time to babysit trainees who might get my soldiers killed. The frontline positions were a maze of trenches, destroyed buildings, and improvised fortifications carved out of what had once been a peaceful farming community. The civilians had long since fled, leaving behind empty houses that now served as deadly terrain for opposing armies to fight over. Every building was a potential sniper nest. Every window was a firing position. Every shadow could hide an enemy waiting to kill. Captain Sergeyev led Ludmilla through the communication trenches toward the forward positions, pointing out the areas where sniper activity had been heaviest. The trenches themselves told the story of desperate fighting. They were deeper and more elaborate than training manuals suggested, with multiple levels and interconnected tunnels that allowed movement without exposure to enemy observation. See that bell tower about 400 meters north? Captain Sergeyev pointed toward a damaged church that stood above the surrounding ruins. We've taken fire from that position at least 6 times in the past week. Every time we try to approach it, the sniper disappears. Every time we think it's clear, someone else gets shot. Ludmilla studied the tower through her binoculars. It was an obvious sniper position, offering commanding views of the entire sector. Too obvious. Captain, has anyone been watching that tower when the shots come from it? What do you mean? I mean, are we certain the shots are actually coming from the tower? Or are they coming from somewhere else, making us think the tower is the threat? Captain Sergey frowned. The trajectory analysis suggested the shots came from elevation. The tower is the highest point in the area. But there are other elevated positions. That apartment building to the east has a partially collapsed top floor. Those grain silos have sight lines to your trenches. If I wanted to make you think I was in the tower, I'd shoot from somewhere else and let you waste time watching the wrong position. It was a sophisticated analysis from someone who had never been in combat, and Captain Sergey found himself reevaluating his initial assessment of the young woman. Explain your theory. The enemy knows we can see the tower. They know we'll watch it, so they use it as a decoy. They take their actual shots from concealed positions and let us focus our attention on the obvious threat. Meanwhile, the real sniper is somewhere else entirely. How would we test this theory? Ludmilla was quiet for several moments, studying the entire area through her binoculars. We set up in a position where we can watch both the tower and the alternate locations. When the next shot comes, we ignore the tower and immediately scan the other areas for muzzle flash or movement. And if you're wrong, then you transfer me to supply duty and forget I was ever here. Captain Sergeyev considered the proposal. It was unconventional, but conventional tactics had failed repeatedly against this particular enemy. All right, we'll try it your way. But if any of my men get killed because of this experiment, you'll answer to me personally. They established an observation post in the ruins of a farmhouse that offered clear views of both the church tower and the alternate positions Ludmilla had identified. 2 other soldiers joined them, Sergeant Pavel Kozin, an experienced infantryman who knew the local terrain, and Private Mikhail Volkov, a young soldier who had shown good instincts for fieldcraft. For 6 hours, they watched and waited. This was Ludmilla's first experience with the grinding tedium that was a fundamental part of sniper warfare. Hours of complete stillness, fighting off thirst, hunger, and the natural urge to move, all while maintaining absolute alertness for the few seconds when action might be required. During the wait, she learned more about the enemy they were facing. Sergeant Kozin had been fighting in this sector for 3 weeks and had developed a grudging respect for the German snipers' abilities. They're not like the regular infantry, he explained quietly. These are specialists, probably specially trained for urban warfare. They move at night, never use the same position twice, and they're incredibly patient. One of them waited 2 days for a clear shot at our company commander. 2 full days without moving. How do you know he waited 2 days? Ludmilla asked. Because we found his position afterward. There were ration wrappers, signs that he'd been there for an extended period. He had multiple escape routes planned, alternate positions prepared. These aren't amateurs. At 1400 hours, the shot came. A single rifle crack echoed across the ruins, and immediately they heard shouting from the Soviet positions. Another soldier had been hit. Just as Ludmilla had predicted, their instinctive reaction was to scan the church tower for signs of the sniper. But Ludmilla forced herself to ignore the tower and instead swept her binoculars across the alternate positions she had identified. For several seconds, she saw nothing. Then, in the upper floor of the damaged apartment building, she caught a brief glimpse of movement. Something had shifted in one of the broken windows. There, she whispered, pointing toward the apartment building. 3rd floor, 2nd window from the left. I saw movement. Captain Sergey focused his binoculars on the indicated position. I don't see anything. He's there. The movement was subtle, but it was deliberate. Someone shifting position after taking a shot. Can you make the shot from here? Ludmilla calculated the distance and conditions. The apartment building was approximately 600 meters away, well within her capability range. The wind was minimal, and the angle was favorable. But this would be her first shot at a human being, her first test under actual combat conditions. I can make the shot, but I need to be certain he's there. I won't shoot at shadows. They continued to watch the building for another hour. Finally, their patience was rewarded. A glint of sunlight reflected off metal in the window Ludmilla had identified. A rifle scope or barrel, visible for just a moment as the sniper adjusted his position. I see him, Captain Sergeyev said. Can you take the shot? Ludmilla settled into her firing position, checking every detail of her setup. Rifle stable and properly supported. Scope focused and adjusted for distance. Breathing controlled and steady. All environmental factors calculated and compensated for. Through her scope, she could see the window clearly. The target was barely visible, just a shadow behind broken glass with occasional glimpses of equipment. This was nothing like the clear, obvious targets she had practiced against during training. This was a skilled enemy sniper, carefully concealed and alert to danger. Range 600 meters, she whispered. Wind negligible. Target partially concealed, but stationary. She waited for the perfect moment when her breathing was controlled and her pulse was steady. In her mind, she could hear Major Kozlov